There is a peculiar observation that strikes anyone who has worked deeply with the human psyche. The people who present themselves as most virtuous, most morally upright, most devoted to goodness are often the ones who harbor the deepest darkness. Not because they are hypocrites, though some may be, but because their very commitment to perfection creates a shadow so dense, so powerful, that it eventually erupts in ways that shock everyone, including themselves. The minister who rails against sin while secretly indulging in the very behaviors he condemns. The activist who fights tirelessly for justice while treating those closest to them with cruelty. The parent who demands perfection from their children while nursing a private rage that terrifies them when it surfaces. This is not coincidence, it is not weakness of character. It is the inevitable consequence of a psychological law. Whatever we deny in ourselves does not disappear. It goes underground, it gathers force, and it returns often in the most destructive ways possible. When we speak of moral perfection, we are speaking of an ideal, an image of absolute goodness, purity, righteousness, and ideals by their very nature are one-sided. They demand that we become only the light and reject the darkness. They demand that we embody only virtue and expel vice. They demand that we split ourselves in two and identify entirely with one half while banishing the other. And this split, this division of the psyche into acceptable and unacceptable parts, is the origin of psychological darkness. The shadow is born from moral judgment. Every time we say, "I am not that," every time we declare certain qualities evil or forbidden, we create shadow material. The child who is taught that anger is bad learns to suppress anger. The young woman who is taught that sexuality is shameful learns to suppress sexual feelings. The man who is taught that weakness is contemptible learns to suppress vulnerability. And all of this, suppressed material, accumulates in the unconscious, forming a counter-personality, a dark double that contains everything the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. Now, the more rigidly we identify with moral perfection, the larger and more dangerous this shadow becomes. The person who has a moderate moral framework, who acknowledges their flaws, who accepts that they are human and therefore imperfect, maintains a relatively small shadow. They admit to themselves when they feel jealous or angry or petty. They do not pretend to be saints. And because they acknowledge these qualities consciously, those qualities do not gain autonomous power in the unconscious. But the person who strives for moral perfection, who cannot tolerate any deviation from their idealized self-image, must suppress enormous amounts of psychological material. They cannot admit to jealousy because jealousy is morally wrong. They cannot admit to anger because anger is a sin. They cannot admit to selfish desires because selfishness contradicts their identity as a good person. And so all of this material, all of these normal human feelings and impulses must be pushed down, denied, rejected. The shadow grows massive, it becomes a realm of tremendous energy and power. And it does not remain passive. The shadow, denied conscious expression, begins to express itself unconsciously. It leaks out in small ways at first. The morally perfect person becomes subtly judgmental of others. They notice and criticize in others the very qualities they deny in themselves. The person who cannot admit their own anger becomes hypersensitive to aggression in others. The person who cannot admit their own sexual feelings becomes preoccupied with policing the sexuality of others. This is projection. The shadow contents are cast outward, attributed to other people, and then condemned in those people. This allows the ego to maintain its identification with moral perfection while still engaging with the rejected material, albeit indirectly. But projection is not enough to contain a large shadow indefinitely. The pressure builds. The suppressed material demands release, and eventually it breaks through. Sometimes this breakthrough is dramatic and public. The moral crusader is caught in the very act they have been condemning. The pious leader is exposed in scandal. The righteous parent is revealed to have been abusive behind closed doors. These are not isolated incidents. They are the predictable result of extreme moral identification, creating extreme shadow compensation. Other times, the breakthrough is more private, but no less destructive. The person who has maintained perfect moral behavior for years suddenly finds themselves in the grip of compulsions they cannot control. They develop addictions. They engage in behaviors that horrify them. They act out in ways that contradict everything they believe about themselves. And they cannot understand why they experience it as possession, as being taken over by something alien. And in a sense, they are right. They are being possessed by their own shadow, which has grown so powerful through years of denial that it can now override the conscious will. Let me give you a concrete example. Consider a man who has been raised in a strict religious environment where any form of aggression or anger is considered sinful. He learns to be gentle, kind, patient, forgiving. He never raises his voice. He never expresses frustration. He prides himself on his Christian virtues. He is, by all appearances, a good man. But his anger does not vanish simply because he refuses to acknowledge it. It accumulates in his shadow. And because he cannot express it directly, it begins to express itself indirectly. He develops passive-aggressive behaviors. He withdraws affection as punishment. He makes cutting remarks disguised as jokes. He becomes controlling under the guise of caring. His family walks on eggshells around him, sensing the rage beneath the surface, even though he never openly expresses it. And he himself remains unconscious of this rage. He genuinely believes he is a peaceful, loving person. The shadow has become so split off that he cannot see it, even when it is destroying his relationships. And then one day, the pressure becomes too great. Perhaps his wife threatens to leave him. Perhaps his children confront him. Perhaps something in his outer life collapses. And in that moment of crisis, the shadow erupts. He explodes in a rage that terrifies everyone, including himself. He says things he never thought himself capable of saying. He acts in ways that contradict every value he holds. And when it is over, when he returns to consciousness, he is devastated. He cannot understand what happened. He feels as though he was possessed by a demon. And, psychologically speaking, he was. The demon was his own denied anger, grown so powerful through decades of suppression that it could no longer be contained. Or consider a woman who has dedicated her life to social justice, to fighting oppression and inequality. She has internalized the belief that she must be morally pure, that she must never harbor prejudice or bias, that she must always be on the right side of every issue. And this belief is sincere. She genuinely cares about justice. But the human psyche contains all manner of biases, prejudices, and shadow material that do not align with conscious ideals. And she cannot acknowledge any of this without threatening her moral identity. So she projects it. She becomes hyper-vigilant to the moral failings of others. She engages in public shaming. She divides the world into the morally pure and the morally corrupt. And she positions herself firmly on the side of purity. But the more she does this, the more her own shadow grows, because she is denying larger and larger parts of her own humanity. She cannot admit to having mixed feelings about anything. She cannot admit to being tired of activism or resentful of the burden it places on her. She cannot admit to enjoying certain privileges or harboring certain biases. All of this must be suppressed, and the suppression makes her rigid, intolerant, and ultimately cruel in the name of justice. Her shadow begins to express itself through her activism itself. She becomes abusive toward those who disagree with her. She engages in character assassination. She loses the capacity for nuance or compassion. She becomes what she claims to fight against, an authoritarian figure who demands absolute conformity and punishes any deviation. And she cannot see this because her identification with moral perfection is so complete that she has lost all capacity for self-reflection. She is convinced that her cruelty is righteousness, that her intolerance is justice, that her abuse is activism. The shadow has taken control, but it wears the mask of virtue. This is the terrible paradox of moral perfection. The more we strive to be only good, only virtuous, only right, the more darkness we create within ourselves. The more we identify with the light, the more powerful the shadow becomes. And the shadow, once it grows large enough, does not merely influence our behavior from the unconscious. It takes control. It possesses us. and we find ourselves doing exactly what we most condemned, becoming exactly what we most feared, enacting the very evils we dedicated ourselves to fighting. Now, why does the psyche operate this way? Why can we not simply choose to be good and have that be the end of it? Because the psyche is a self-regulating system. It seeks balance, not perfection. It seeks wholeness, not one-sidedness. When we push too far in one direction, the psyche compensates by pushing back in the other direction. This is not a moral failing. It is a psychological law, and it operates whether we acknowledge it or not. The person who identifies entirely with goodness will be compensated by eruptions of badness. The person who identifies entirely with strength will be compensated by experiences of weakness. The person who identifies entirely with rationality will be compensated by overwhelming emotionality. This compensation is not punishment. It is the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to bring the rejected material back into consciousness, to force the ego to acknowledge what it has denied. But when this compensation happens unconsciously, when the ego refuses to see what is happening, the compensation becomes destructive. It does not lead to integration. It leads to dissociation, to acting out, to the very moral failures that the person most feared. The only way to prevent this destructive compensation is to acknowledge the shadow before it accumulates too much power, to admit to ourselves that we are not morally perfect, that we contain light and darkness, that we are human and therefore flawed. This acknowledgement is difficult. It threatens our moral identity. It requires us to admit that we are capable of the things we condemn. It requires us to see that the line between good and evil does not run between us and others, but through the middle of every human heart, including our own. This is humbling, it is painful, and it is absolutely necessary if we are to avoid the destruction that moral perfection inevitably brings. Let us speak now of the archetypal dimension of this phenomenon, because the pattern of moral perfection creating darkness is not merely a personal issue. It is an archetypal pattern that appears throughout human history and mythology. In religious traditions, we see it in the figure of the fallen angel, Lucifer, who was the most perfect, most beautiful, most righteous of all the angels, and who fell into the deepest darkness precisely because of his perfection. His identification with the light was so complete that he could not tolerate any shadow, and so the shadow consumed him entirely. We see it in the myth of the hero who becomes the tyrant. The hero begins with noble intentions, with a desire to save the world, to establish justice, to create paradise. But the more perfectly he pursues this vision, the more ruthless he becomes toward anything that threatens it. He begins to sacrifice people in the name of his ideals. He becomes the very thing he set out to destroy. This is the pattern that repeats in political revolutions, in religious movements, in any collective endeavor that identifies too completely with moral perfection. The archetype of the shadow is personified in many traditions as the devil, the adversary, the trickster. But if we look closely, we see that these figures are not simply external enemies. They are the rejected aspects of the divine or heroic figure itself. The devil is the shadow of God. The trickster is the shadow of the civilizing hero. They represent what is excluded from consciousness in the pursuit of moral perfection, and they return to wreak havoc precisely because they were excluded. In the Christian tradition, we have the story of Christ in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. This is often interpreted as a battle between good and evil, between Jesus and an external demon. But from a psychological perspective, it can be understood as Christ confronting his own shadow, acknowledging the temptations and possibilities that exist within human nature, and integrating them consciously rather than denying them. It is only after this confrontation that Christ is able to begin his ministry. The implication is clear. Moral authority requires shadow integration, not shadow denial. But Christianity as an institution has often failed to embody this wisdom. It has instead created rigid moral categories, splitting humanity into saved and damned, virtuous and sinful, pure and corrupt. And this splitting has created enormous collective shadow that has erupted throughout history in witch hunts, inquisitions, religious wars, and the sexual abuse scandals that have plagued churches in our own time. The more emphatically an institution proclaims its moral perfection, the more catastrophically its shadow will erupt. This is true not only of religious institutions, but of any collective movement that identifies with moral superiority. Political movements, social justice causes, therapeutic communities, even psychological and spiritual organizations can fall into this trap. The more they identify with being on the right side, with being morally pure, the more shadow they accumulate, and the more likely they are to engage in the very behaviors they claim to oppose: intolerance, cruelty, dehumanization, authoritarianism. The antidote to this pattern is not to abandon morality. It is not to embrace nihilism or moral relativism. It is to develop what we might call a mature morality, a morality that acknowledges human complexity and limitation. A mature morality recognizes that we are all capable of both good and evil, that moral judgment is necessary but must be applied with humility and self-awareness, that the greatest danger comes not from those who openly embrace darkness, but from those who identify completely with light and remain unconscious of their own shadow. In the process of individuation, we must move beyond the childish morality of absolutes. We must develop the capacity to hold paradox, to acknowledge that we contain opposites, to be neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but something more complex and more human. This does not mean moral indifference. It means moral maturity. It means taking responsibility for our shadow rather than projecting it onto others. It means recognizing that the capacity for evil exists within us and must be acknowledged and integrated rather than denied and repressed. Let me return to the personal level and speak practically about what this integration looks like. It begins with the willingness to see ourselves honestly without the filter of moral judgment. When we feel anger, we do not immediately condemn ourselves as bad people. We acknowledge the anger. We explore where it comes from. We recognize it as a natural human emotion. We decide consciously how to express it or whether to express it, but we do not deny its existence. When we feel jealousy or envy, we do not immediately repress these feelings out of shame. We look at them. We ask what they are telling us about our own desires and frustrations. We recognize that these feelings are information, not sins. When we notice prejudices or biases in ourselves, we do not deny them out of fear that they make us bad people. We acknowledge them, we examine their origins, we work to understand them without identifying with them or acting them out unconsciously. This kind of honesty is difficult because it requires us to give up the comforting fiction that we are morally pure. It requires us to admit that we are works in progress, that we contain darkness as well as light, that we are capable of the things we condemn in others. But this admission is liberating. It frees us from the exhausting task of maintaining a perfect facade. It allows us to be human, and paradoxically, it makes us more genuinely moral, because our morality is now based on conscious choice and self-awareness rather than on repression and denial. The person who acknowledges their capacity for anger is less likely to act out destructively than the person who denies all anger. The person who acknowledges their selfish impulses is more likely to act generously than the person who identifies completely with selflessness and secretly resents every act of giving. The person who acknowledges their prejudices is more likely to treat others fairly than the person who insists they have no prejudices and therefore never examines their behavior. This is the great paradox. Moral perfection creates immorality, while the acknowledgement of imperfection creates genuine ethical behavior. The person who admits they are flawed can work consciously with their flaws. The person who insists they are perfect can only deny their flaws, which then express themselves unconsciously in destructive ways. Now, we must also speak of the role of guilt and shame in this process, because these emotions are often weaponized to enforce moral perfection and create shadow. Guilt is the feeling that we have done something wrong. Shame is the feeling that we are something wrong. Both of these emotions have a legitimate function. They tell us when we have violated our values or harmed others. They can motivate us to make amends and change our behavior. But in systems that demand moral perfection, guilt and shame become toxic. They are used not to correct actual wrongdoing, but to punish any deviation from the ideal. The person feels guilty not for harming others, but for having feelings or thoughts that the system deems unacceptable. They feel ashamed not for their actions, but for their very nature, for being human rather than perfect. This toxic guilt and shame drive the creation of shadow. The person cannot tolerate these feelings, so they suppress everything that might trigger them. They create an idealized self-image that is immune to guilt and shame, and they identify completely with this image. But the suppressed material does not go away. It forms the shadow, which then acts out in ways that create real guilt and real shame, which the person still cannot acknowledge, so they suppress even more, and the cycle continues and intensifies. Breaking this cycle requires differentiating between neurotic guilt and realistic guilt, between toxic shame and healthy remorse. Neurotic guilt is feeling bad about having normal human feelings and thoughts. Realistic guilt is feeling bad about actually harming someone. Toxic shame is believing we are fundamentally bad or unworthy. Healthy remorse is acknowledging that we have made mistakes and can learn from them. When we can make these distinctions, we free ourselves from the tyranny of moral perfection. We can acknowledge our shadow without being destroyed by shame. We can feel appropriate guilt when we harm others without drowning in neurotic guilt for being human. We can work toward being better people without demanding that we be perfect people. And this is the path of integration. Let me speak also of the collective dimension of this work, because the problem of moral perfection creating darkness is not only individual, it is also social and political. In our current moment, we see this pattern playing out on a massive scale. Groups on all sides of political and cultural divides identify with moral perfection and project all evil onto their opponents. The result is polarization, dehumanization, and an escalating cycle of righteous outrage that makes genuine dialogue and problem-solving impossible. Each side believes it occupies the moral high ground. Each side is convinced that it represents the light, while the other side represents darkness. And this conviction makes shadow integration impossible, because to acknowledge one's own shadow would be to admit moral equivalence with the enemy, which is unthinkable. So the shadow is projected ever more forcefully onto the other, and the other becomes not merely wrong but evil, not merely misguided, but demonic. This is collective possession by the shadow. When groups identify too completely with moral perfection, they lose the capacity for self-reflection. They cannot see their own contribution to conflict. They cannot acknowledge their own capacity for cruelty, intolerance, and injustice. They can only see these qualities in the enemy. And the more they fight the enemy, the more they become like the enemy, enacting the very behaviors they claim to oppose. The way out of this collective madness is through individual shadow work. If enough individuals in a society take responsibility for their own shadow, if enough people refuse to participate in the projection of evil onto others, the collective field begins to shift. This does not mean abandoning one's values or refusing to stand against genuine injustice. It means doing so from a place of humility and self-awareness rather than from a place of moral superiority and shadow projection. It means being able to say, I believe this policy is wrong, but I acknowledge that I may be mistaken. I oppose this behavior, but I recognize my own capacity for similar behavior under different circumstances. I stand for these values, but I do not claim to embody them perfectly. This kind of stance is rare because it requires tremendous psychological maturity. It is much easier to split the world into good and evil and identify with the good. But the easy path leads to destruction. The difficult path leads to integration and genuine moral development. Let me speak now of the specific mechanisms through which moral perfection creates its shadow. The first mechanism is what we might call psychological splitting. When we identify with an ideal of perfection, we must divide our experience into two categories: that which conforms to the ideal and that which does not. Everything that conforms is acknowledged, cultivated, expressed. Everything that does not conform is denied, suppressed, hidden. This creates a fundamental split in the psyche, a division between the acceptable self and the unacceptable self. The acceptable self becomes the persona, the mask we show to the world and to ourselves. It is composed of all the qualities we believe we should have, all the feelings we believe we should feel, all the thoughts we believe we should think. The persona is not false in the sense of being deliberately deceptive. It is a genuine part of us, but it is only a part. And when we identify completely with the persona, when we believe that the persona is the totality of who we are, we lose contact with the rest of ourselves. The unacceptable self becomes the shadow, the rejected and denied aspects of our being. It is composed of all the qualities we believe we should not have, all the feelings we believe we should not feel, all the thoughts we believe we should not think. And because these qualities are denied consciousness, they do not disappear. They go underground. They form an autonomous complex in the unconscious, a sub-personality that operates according to its own logic and purposes. The second mechanism is what we might call moral inflation. When we identify with moral perfection, we are not simply trying to be good. We are trying to be perfectly good. We are trying to transcend our humanity to become something more than human. This is a form of inflation, of identification with an archetype that is beyond human capacity. We are trying to become the saint, the hero, the savior, the perfectly virtuous being. But this inflation has a price. The higher we inflate ourselves, the deeper the compensatory deflation must be. The more we identify with perfection, the more imperfection accumulates in the shadow. The more we try to be godlike, the more we activate the demonic. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how the psyche maintains balance. The psyche will not allow us to identify completely with one pole. It will always create a counterbalance. The third mechanism is what we might call the tyranny of the superego. The superego is the internalized voice of moral authority, the part of the psyche that judges, criticizes, and demands conformity to ideals. A healthy superego provides guidance and helps us navigate moral choices. But when we strive for moral perfection, the superego becomes tyrannical. It demands the impossible. It punishes any deviation. It creates a constant state of internal surveillance and self-criticism. Under the tyranny of the superego, we can never relax. We can never simply be. We are always monitoring ourselves for signs of moral failure, always afraid that we will be found wanting, always trying to prove our worthiness. This creates enormous psychological tension and exhaustion. And the more tightly the superego grips us, the more powerfully the shadow rebels. The shadow becomes the repository of all the freedom, spontaneity, and authenticity that the tyrannical superego forbids. The fourth mechanism is what we might call moral dissociation. When we cannot integrate certain aspects of ourselves, when the gap between who we are and who we believe we should be becomes too large, we dissociate. We split off entire parts of our experience. We lose the ability to recognize our own shadow when it acts. We develop blind spots so profound that we can engage in the very behaviors we condemn and genuinely not see what we are doing. This is how the pious minister can preach against adultery while having an affair and not experience the contradiction consciously. This is how the social justice activist can abuse their colleagues while fighting for justice and not see the hypocrisy. The dissociation is so complete that the shadow acts while the ego maintains its identification with perfection. The person is not consciously lying, they are genuinely unaware. The psyche is split to such a degree that the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. These mechanisms work together to create a psychological system in which moral perfection generates its opposite. The harder we try to be only good, the more powerfully we activate the bad. The more we identify with light, the more darkness we create, and this darkness does not remain passive. It seeks expression. It finds ways to act out, to compensate for the one-sidedness of consciousness, to restore balance to the psyche. As we near the end of this reflection, let me address directly those who are deeply committed to moral and spiritual development. If you find yourself striving for perfection, if you judge yourself harshly for your flaws, if you are constantly monitoring yourself for signs of moral failure, please understand. This very striving is creating the darkness you fear. Your perfectionism is not making you a better person. It is making you a more divided person. It is creating a shadow that will eventually erupt and force you to confront what you have denied. The path of individuation is not the path of perfection. It is the path of wholeness. It requires that you acknowledge the full spectrum of your humanity, that you integrate what you have rejected, that you become acquainted with your shadow and bring it into conscious relationship with your ego. This does not mean acting out every impulse. It means knowing what impulses you have, understanding where they come from, and making conscious choices about how to relate to them. You do not become whole by identifying only with the light. You become whole by acknowledging that you contain both light and darkness, by refusing to project your darkness onto others, by taking responsibility for your entire psychological makeup. This is difficult work. It requires courage, honesty, and humility. But it is the only work that truly matters, because without it, you will remain forever divided, forever at war with yourself, forever creating the darkness you are trying to escape. The path forward requires a fundamental shift in how we understand morality itself. We must move from a morality of perfection to a morality of integration. We must move from a morality that demands we be only one thing to a morality that acknowledges we are many things. We must move from a morality that splits the world into good and evil to a morality that recognizes the complexity and ambiguity inherent in all human action. This does not mean abandoning moral discernment. It does not mean embracing nihilism or saying that all actions are equally valid. It means developing the capacity to make moral judgments while remaining aware of our own limitations, our own biases, our own shadow. It means acting ethically, not from a place of moral superiority, but from a place of humble recognition that we too are capable of the things we oppose. If this exploration has challenged something in you, if it has touched upon patterns you recognize in yourself or in the world around you, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to Psyche and Meaning. This work exists for those who are willing to look honestly at the shadow, who understand that depth and meaning require us to face what we would rather deny. Your engagement helps this content reach others who are ready for this confrontation. And so we return to the beginning. The person who strives for moral perfection, who cannot tolerate any flaw or failing, who identifies completely with goodness and virtue, is not thereby freed from darkness. They are creating darkness, a shadow so powerful that it will eventually consume them if they do not turn toward it and acknowledge it. The path to genuine morality is not through the denial of shadow, but through its integration. The path to becoming a good person is not through claiming to be perfect, but through admitting that you are human, flawed, capable of both light and darkness. This admission is not defeat, it is liberation. It frees you from the exhausting performance of moral perfection. It allows you to be real rather than ideal. And paradoxically, it makes genuine moral development possible, because you are now working with your actual nature rather than with an idealized fantasy. The work of individuation is the work of becoming whole, and wholeness includes the shadow. There is no other way. The darkness you create through moral perfection must eventually be confronted and integrated, or it will destroy you. This is not a threat. It is a description of how the psyche works, and understanding this is the beginning of wisdom. The shadow awaits your acknowledgement. The question is only whether you will turn toward it voluntarily or wait until it forces itself upon you in crisis. Choose wisely.